Hello, and welcome to our third instructional video on how to plan UAS flight operations. This series of videos is brought to you by AmericaView in partnership with the College of Natural Resources and Environment at Virginia Tech, the Virginia Cooperative Extension, and GeoTed UAS. My name is Daniel Cross, and I will continue to be your guide. In this video, we will be creating a simple automated flight plan with a fixed-wing UAS. We will map the area that we scouted using Google Earth in the last video, and we will start working with some of the concepts from the first video of this series. As we have discussed previously, there are many different types of flight planning software. The one that is right for you will be specific to the UAV and area you want to fly. For this example, we will spend most of our time using eMotion 3, software that only works with SenseFly UAVs. I will also use Mission Planner to show you one aspect of fixed-wing planning that can differ between software suites in a very important way. Let's start by creating a mission at Kentland Farm. We'll start by setting our virtual fence. This is a virtual boundary that if the UAV crosses during flight, it will perform a preset automated routine. In this case, it's hard-coded to warn the pilot, then return to the home waypoint and await further instructions. Here, I can set both vertical and horizontal distances for a cylindrical boundary. Now, not all virtual fences are going to be the same. Some will only be a horizontal boundary and will not limit your altitude. Some will allow you to draw a polygonal boundary instead of a circular one, and some will allow the pilot to program what happens when the boundary is breached. Next, we want to pick our base imagery, and then save it to the device that we'll be flying our UAS with. This will allow us to work in the field without an internet connection. Here, we have several options to pick from. When possible, I like to download a normal background image like this one, as well as a topographic map. You may notice that it is also downloading an elevation model with the imagery. The flight planner is capable of changing the altitude of the flight plan to match changes in ground elevation for us. This is a critical feature when you're flying in hilly or mountainous terrain. Now we will want to set our takeoff and landing locations. It's worth noting that you do not have to take off and land from the same location, and this can be very advantageous when you're working in difficult terrain. When you're deciding the location of these points, make sure that there are no nearby trees, buildings, power lines, or metal objects, including reinforced concrete. These can degrade your GNSS signal and compass accuracy. During takeoff and landing, you really want your UAV to know precisely where it is and what direction it's pointed. A traditional fixed-wing UAV can't take off like a quadcopter. It needs an open area to climb out through, just like a regular airplane. I'm going to put my takeoff point here on the end of the runway. This circle above the takeoff point is the start waypoint, or the first waypoint the UAV will go to after takeoff. This UAV, by default, will turn into the wind after it has been launched. However, if I need to keep a specific heading, I can turn on the Directional Takeoff feature. This allows me to tell the UAV to head in a specific compass heading until it reaches this specified altitude. This way I know that it won't hit anything on the way out. Now I need to tell it where and how to land. Just like takeoff, most fixed-wing UAVs will need a fairly large open area to land in, so I need to make sure that I vector it in so that it avoids any obstacles. I do so by placing a point here in the grass, since I don't want it to hit the hard pavement of the runway. Now, I need to tell it what direction to land from. If at all possible, I want to make sure that it is landing into the wind. This specific UAV is capable of sensing the wind speed and direction, so instead of giving it one single direction, I will place two cone-shaped landing vectors. This will allow the UAV to pick its landing direction in real time from these two cones, so that it can land into the wind, or as close as I'm willing to allow it. This system also allows me to make sure that it's going to avoid any obstacles, such as these power lines to the north or buildings to the west. One last thing to keep in mind while you're setting up your landing. Make sure that there is an open area on the back side of the landing vector as well. This will help you avoid accidents if you need to abort the landing. Now we need to create a mission area for us to map. For this example, I'm going to create a basic area mapping mission over the fields we previously scouted. I'm going to do this by drawing a polygon around those fields. It's as simple as dragging these vertices to where I need them, and I can add new vertices by clicking the polygon boundary. These lawnmower pattern lines in the mission area are the software automatically generating flight lines for me. Now that our mission area is delineated, we need to pick the camera we want to use. In this case, we'll be using a multispectral sensor. We also want to set how the software will determine the UAV's altitude. The most common options for this are above mean sea level, also known as MSL or true altitude, above takeoff or ATO, and above an elevation model. Some UAVs are also equipped with a ground sensor that can be used to maintain a more precise altitude above the ground. For most missions, I find it best to use elevation models. This way my UAV will try to maintain a consistent altitude above the ground. Next, we want to set the actual altitude for the mission. With this flight planner, you set the desired image resolution, and the software figures out the actual altitude. Remember, unless you have a waiver, you should not exceed 400 feet above the ground level, or AGL. We want to leave a little bit of a buffer to account for genus error, especially when working in hilly or mountainous terrain, or flying a fixed-wing UAV. This is because our elevation models are not perfectly accurate, and fixed-wing UAVs cannot follow topography as well as rotary-wing UAVs. Also, fixed-wing UAVs tend to have a camera on a fixed mount, so the flight lines need to be level to keep the camera pointed straight down. This flight planner takes an average of the elevation model for each flight line, then flies at the specified altitude above that average. So in mountainous terrain, you can easily find yourself flying higher or lower than expected. Now we need to set our image overlap. As you recall from our first video, we need to make sure that the images overlap enough that the post-processing software can stitch them together. A 65% front to back and 75% side to side overlap will work well for this area. However, if you're flying over something with very little texture, like a large wheat field, or over an area with lots of texture, like a forest, you may need to increase the overlap, which will in turn decrease the area you can cover. Here you can see the difference between a 75% and 85% side-to-side overlap. This may not seem like much, but if you are flying back-to-back flights, you need to consider both the cost of purchasing more batteries and the time spent recharging them in the field, and those can really add up. Now, it might be tempting to increase the front-to-back overlap, and with a rotary wing UAV, this is a good option. However, cameras can only trigger so fast, and a fixed-wing UAV must maintain a minimum airspeed to remain in flight. Increasing the front-to-back overlap will reduce the maximum airspeed of the aircraft. If the speed required by the camera is lower than the aircraft's minimum allowable speed, the UAV will not be able to achieve the desired overlap. Here we're getting a warning, telling us that the front-to-back overlap will not be possible because it would otherwise force the UAV to fly so slow it would fall out of the sky. Now that we have our parameters set, let's take a look at the flight. One big difference between fixed-wing and rotary-wing flight plans is this overshoot. Since a fixed-wing UAV can't just stop and turn in place, it needs to be able to fly outside of the mapping area to turn around. This is something that we will want to minimize, and if angled wrong, it could take us a little too close to the no-fly zone we found while scouting. We correct this by changing the direction of the flight lines. Notice that when we do this, it also changes the estimated flight time. We need to account for a number of variables here. We want our flight time to be as short as possible for the sake of efficiency, and we want to minimize the time the UAV spends turning around. Generally, this means we want to make our flight lines as long as possible. We also want to make sure the UAV starts its mission on the far end of the mission area. This way, the aircraft will be making its way back to our landing site. If we run into any trouble, such as a strong wind or a battery malfunction, the UAV is already working its way closer to landing. By doing this, we are reducing the risk of a low battery-related accident. We also need to account for wind. A fixed-wing UAV should be mapping with a crosswind, or with the wind coming directly from either the left or right. This way the wind is not affecting the aircraft's speed, which would change the front-to-back overlap and would degrade the data being collected. If we're flying in hilly or mountainous terrain, the flight lines need to be planned parallel to the topographic lines. Otherwise, we'll blow right through our altitude limit or potentially crash into a mountainside. Lastly, we often need to orient our flight lines to avoid obstacles, or in this case, we want to make sure we don't fly too far over the river. Now that our flight plan is ready, let's take a look at our flight stats. This shows us information such as area covered, number of photos, flight line spacing, flight distance, and the number of waypoints. More importantly, it also tells us how long the flight will take. This is just an estimate, so you should tack on a few extra minutes to account for takeoff, landing, and weather. We might have to split this flight into multiple flights if our batteries don't last long enough. This flight is just long enough that with no wind I should be able to do it on one battery, but if there's any wind for the aircraft to fight against, I'll have to plan to finish it with a second battery. Now before we head out to fly, we want to make sure that we give this flight plan a very thorough check and that we are safe to fly. Now let's switch to Mission Planner. With this software, landing and takeoff are very different from eMotion 3's fully automated system. Here, we also need to place a takeoff waypoint. However, if we don't fill in these parameters, the UAV will try to take off by going straight up, which is not advised for a traditional fixed-wing UAV. At the very least, we need to set the pitch angle here. This will tell the UAV what angle it should climb out at. We should also change the default takeoff altitude from 10 meters to something a little higher. This will make sure the UAV doesn't try to start its mission while too low. Landing will be very similar. We will also want to set the abort altitude to a suitably high altitude so as to avoid hitting any obstacles. Lastly, if the UAV is landing at a point that is different from the home waypoint, we need to tell it the ground elevation. Otherwise, it'll try to land at the elevation of the home waypoint, and this could lead to it either plowing into the ground or cutting its motor and falling from far too high. And this shows us why it is critically important to thoroughly read and understand the documentation of the software we use so that we understand the differences and how our UAVs will act. That's it for our basic fixed-wing planning. Please join us in the next video of this series where we will create a basic flight plan for a rotary wing UAV. Fly safe.